The pounding on my door hit like a gavel slammed in the dark, heavy, impatient, certain that whoever lived inside had no right to hesitate. And when the voice followed, "Open up, Lakeshore Crest Community Authority," I was still half asleep, still reaching for my robe, still trying to place that tone in the mental file cabinet where I kept threats I'd heard in my career. But before I could finish one full breath, the door flew inward, and 4 men in black uniforms poured into my house as if my quiet little living room were a crime scene and not a home. One of them barking, "You don't belong here," with the kind of venom people usually reserve for outsiders they've already decided they hate. I stayed still, because stillness is a weapon when chaos is the attack, because 30 years on a federal bench teaches you that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest one. And as my eyes adjusted and my mind sharpened, I saw the truth in small details that most people miss: the cheap tactical patches, the fake authority stitched into fabric, the way they moved like men playing at being police rather than men trained to be police. And I understood, with a cold clarity that woke me, faster than coffee ever could, that these were not real officers. Yet they were acting like they had the right to kick in doors, to shout orders, to decide who belonged in a neighborhood built on manicured lawns and whispered fear. My name is Samuel Granger. I am 74, widowed, retired, and 3 months earlier I had moved into Lakeshore Crest, not to start a war, not to prove a point, not to relive the adrenaline of conflict, but because my daughter Rachel Granger had looked at me across a kitchen table still haunted by my wife's absence and said, "Dad, come closer, let the kids see you more, let the days feel full again." And the brochures promised peace, the realtor promised community, the entrance sign promised dignity, and none of it mentioned that a homeowners association could grow teeth, then fangs, then a bad-shaped delusion. I kept my history quiet, not because I was ashamed, not because I was hiding, but because I had never believed a title should be used as a flashlight to blind other people. So when neighbors asked what I used to do, I simply said I was a retired federal employee, which was true enough, and I spent my days in the way older men try to spend them when they're rebuilding themselves, reading mysteries, fixing little things around the house, sorting old stamps, listening to the hum of life through one open window, trying to convince my heart that starting over was still possible. Then came paint, the kind of harmless choice that should never matter: navy blue window frames because my wife loved that color, because the shade reminded me of anniversaries near the ocean, because grief sometimes needs small acts of beauty just to keep breathing. And according to Lakeshore Crest Community Authority rules, those frames were a violation buried deep in a thick manual, and the first warning letter felt like a joke. The second notice came with a small fine that I paid with a sigh, and the third arrived with a tone that felt less like community maintenance and more like a threat wrapped in stationery. That was when my neighbor Teresa Delgado, a retired attorney with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled, leaned close and said, "Be careful. Samuel, the HOA president, Gordon Ketter, runs this place like it's his private kingdom, and people who challenge him don't just get fines, they get pressure, they get watched, they get pushed." A week later, I noticed the photography, not casual, not neighborly, but methodical, the camera angles chosen like evidence collection, the attention fixed on my windows as if paint were a felony. And when I stepped outside to ask what was going on, the man retreated too quickly, slipping into a black SUV like someone who never intended to be questioned. And by evening there was another notice, a bigger fine, a warning about enforcement actions, a phrase that did not belong in a neighborhood handbook but sounded perfectly at home in a system that wanted people scared. I went to the monthly meeting because I refused to fear paperwork, and what I saw there explained everything without explaining anything. Gordon Ketter at the front with silver hair arranged like he'd never let the wind touch it, a watch that gleamed like a threat. Beside him Darren Pike, a barrel-chested former cop who looked like intimidation had become his hobby, and Mallory Sykes, thin and silent, taking notes like a witness to something she didn't want to stop. And when the agenda reached compliance, Ketter locked onto me like he'd been waiting for the moment all week, telling the room I believed the rules were optional, telling the room one violation would turn their upscale community into a common neighborhood, as if dignity came from paint codes and not from human decency. I raised my hand. I spoke calmly. I tried to sound like a neighbor rather than a fight, and he cut me off mid-sentence with a line that landed like a slap. The rules aren't a buffet. Mr. Granger, you don't get to choose. And the room behaved the way fearful rooms behave. Some people nodding too quickly because they wanted to be safe, some looking down because they didn't want to be next. The next morning, the phone call came, short, cold, personal. We know what you're doing. Comply, or you'll have to leave. And for a moment, I stood there holding the phone in my hand, thinking about how absurd it was that in all my years dealing with dangerous people, I never expected a threat would come over window frames in a neighborhood that sold itself as a dream. What they didn't know, what Keter didn't know, was that my path had crossed his before, 15 years earlier, when his development company, back when he was still wearing real power instead of pretend power, had sat under the lights of a federal courtroom facing fraud and environmental violations, and I had ruled against them, and his empire had shrunk, and his reputation cracked. And I never forgot the look in his eyes that day, the look of a man who believed consequences were something that happened to other people. He didn't recognize me now, and I didn't announce myself, because I wasn't here to replay old battles. I was here to live quietly. But when the harassment began to stack up like a rigged game, grass measured by half inches, trash cans timed like crimes, noise complaints because I was restoring an old clock in my garage, I did what I've always done when someone thinks they can bully their way into being right. I documented everything. Dates, times, letters, phone calls, patterns, and every piece of paper felt less like an HOA dispute and more like the early pages of something ugly. That was when I found allies. Teresa first, then Ethan Park, an IT engineer across the street who said, "That's classic Keter. He hit me last year until I gave in." And together we started quietly connecting dots, talking to former residents who had left under pressure, hearing the same story repeated with different names, selective enforcement, escalating fines. Then a convenient offer from Cedaline Realty Group at below-market prices, and the deeper we looked, the more it stopped feeling like petty tyranny and started feeling like an organized push, like they weren't just policing paint, they were clearing properties. Then came the letter demanding an interior compliance inspection, claiming neighbors were concerned, accusing me of suspicious behavior, hinting I might be violating single-family residence rules, an absurd overreach wrapped in official language. And instead of refusing loudly, I chose a different strategy, because arrogance loves a stage, and I decided to give them one. The night before the scheduled inspection, Ethan sent a message that tightened every nerve in my body. Urgent. They're planning to raid you at dawn. They have an HOA search warrant. And I smiled in the dark, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, because people like Keter always think intimidation is a shortcut, and I began preparing, cameras checked, documents laid out, tea service polished. The kind of calm preparation that looks gentle until you realize it's a trap. Set with patience. At 6 a.m. the next morning, the pounding began exactly on schedule, louder than before, more theatrical, more aggressive, and I was already dressed, already awake, already sipping coffee, already watching the clock like a judge watching counsel walk toward a mistake. And when I opened the door, 4 men in black uniforms stood there with patches reading Lakeshore Crest Enforcement Unit. As if sewing words onto fabric could grant the right to violate a home. Gordon Keter stood in front, flushed with excitement and nerves, holding a document he tried to present like a warrant, while Darren Pike played the muscle, barking "Step aside," and I examined the paper slowly, not correcting him, not challenging him yet, simply noting the forged language, the invented authority, the way it tried to imitate law without actually being law. And then I stepped back and said, calmly, almost politely, "By all means, come in," because sometimes the best way to expose a lie is to let it speak until it can't breathe. They entered like they owned the place, photographing my walls, opening closets, walking toward my kitchen like it was their inspection zone, rummaging through drawers with the confidence of men who believed the neighborhood would protect them, and I watched, silent, because silence is sometimes the loudest form of control. And their discomfort began the moment they realized I wasn't afraid, because fear is the fuel they run on, and without it, their performance started slipping. They listed violations like a desperate script: unapproved bathroom paint, non-regulation ceiling fan, suspected business operation, because I had a home office. And then one of them leaned close and said the line they believed would finish me. "You don't belong here. People like you disrupt communities like ours. Either you comply and pay, or we'll make sure you're removed." That sentence hung in the air like poison. And that was when I walked to my dining table, opened a leather wallet, and placed my federal judicial identification card on the wood, and the room changed instantly, like someone cut the power to their fantasy. "I'm familiar with the law," I said, voice steady, controlled, not raised, because truth never needs to shout. "Trespass, intimidation, impersonation, coercion," and I gestured to the cameras, small, visible now if you knew where to look. "And everything you've done this morning has been recorded." Ketter went pale. Pike froze with his hand in a drawer. The man holding the camera lowered it slowly like it had suddenly become evidence against him. And before they could recover, my daughter Rachel walked in with two real officers, real uniforms, real badges, real authority, and one of them said, "We received a report of individuals impersonating law enforcement. May I see identification from everyone present?" And the raid collapsed into stammering, excuses, and retreat. By afternoon, I was sitting in the office of Mayor Ellen Carver, who admitted Ketter had connections, council allies, developer friends, money flowing through relationships that kept him protected. And when I asked her what she intended to do, she promised investigations, reviews, cooperation, and I listened, because promises matter, but evidence matters more. The real closure came months later, not in a dramatic speech, but in the quiet signs that fear had lost its grip. Ketter removed, the HOA restructured, residents speaking openly without whispering, a mediation committee formed to stop disputes before they became weapons, and on an autumn morning, I sat on my porch with coffee, watching children ride bikes, watching neighbors wave instead of hide, watching the navy window frames catch light like a small, stubborn flag, and I realized the most satisfying justice is not punishment. It is peace returned to the people who were denied it. And now the question I want you to sit with, because it isn't simple, it never is, when someone abuses rules to bully others, when fake authority breaks into real homes, when a community protects power instead of protecting people, is it more ethical to comply for the sake of quiet, or to resist even if resistance shakes the whole neighborhood until the truth finally comes out?